Good evening, and welcome to the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industry's Business Review magazine. This television magazine is an initiative of the GCCI to bring to the fore national topical events that affect the private sector in general and the members of the Chamber in particular. My name is Lance Hines, Senior Vice President of the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and the host of tonight's program. Our focus this evening will be on economic diplomacy. Now, in simplest terms, this is when governments begin to harmonize their policies on their foreign affairs and international trade portfolios. We will discuss the definition and our understanding of this during the program. The overall idea of this would be to seek to attract foreign direct investment, advocate for increased trade in an effort to strengthen the productive resources of this country, to strengthen its economy, and to create sustainable development.
There is a development which has happened within recent times, and that is, which I think is very relevant for a country like Ghana, and that is the conclusion of agreements with what are called subnational entities. Like, for instance, the state of São Paulo in Brazil concludes agreements with Britain, with Germany, with France, and so on. California is the 19th largest economy in the United States. So once we maintain relations with the state, we should also look at, in terms of all capacities, whether there are states or areas that we want to impact with, in terms of finance, in terms of seeking markets, in terms of doing business. That's not the whole country, but it's a small part of that country and deal with it. We have Roraima province in Brazil, for instance, you know? So that I'm saying that there are things that the private sector can do. I mean, I remember years ago talking about the past. We can reorient our attitude towards our consular offices. I think consular offices have been established largely on the basis of where Guyanese exists, to look after the interests of Guyanese. But I don't think we have used consular offices as areas in which they can be business outposts for the country. You know, we did it in São Paulo when Ronald Singh was our consul there, and he was able to bring people like Paranapanimo into Guyana, Older Breck, and so on. So what I'm saying is that there are things which we can tailor our diplomatic efforts and consular efforts to suit our size and our capability. And maybe we need to focus much more on activities of that kind, whilst keeping the relations with the governments, you know. I mean, in China, for instance, Guangdong is an export zone, I think, but it's a place of great activity with Chinese companies. I mean, so we don't necessarily always have to deal with the government, the government of the whole country. I mean, those are the 2 points I just want to make.
I would go a little bit further and suggest that there's a need for some forms of production integration in this region. And yes, we have some resources which we...
I was dealing with Guyana.
No, okay, no. I'm saying even Guyana. Even Guyana.
Okay.
I think there's a need for some form of production integration. If we have the resources that we cannot really exploit, why not seek, through the private sector, joint venture activities with states, even subnational groups in some countries, that could add value to the raw material resources that we have available in Ghana. I think that's one way that we could, in a sense, develop a level of competitiveness for our products through joint venture activity. I also believe that there must be also, Ghana must push for infrastructural integration. Like, I saw the EASA project, for example, you know, the EASA project, which is the initiative coming out of UNASUR, or even before UNASUR, to kind of link countries. Now, I think Ghana should push for that. One, it would reduce transaction costs, because you can have surface communication. Private sector must be pushing that to be able to increase access to markets. You've got markets next door, 200 million, and further down in Latin America, maybe 500 million total. So that I think that those levels of integration have to be priorities for both for states and for groups like the private sector. Initiate efforts at production integration. Look at what we have, what we can. We must no longer think about only being able to export primary products and raw material. Seek partnerships, and even if it's public-private partnerships with the state of some other countries and our own private sectors to raise the level of our competitiveness.
But I think all of this has to be dependent on what happens in Guyana. If you don't have a strong manufacturing sector, if you don't have agriculture in a structured way, you will never be able to satisfy the markets. So I think we need to take cognizance of the fact that Guyana needs a proper plan that will ensure that it understands the outer world and structure what it does to access those markets out there. Because take wharfage. Many reports on Guyana, studies on Guyana, show a need for us to develop our wharves. And if Guyanese are going to export fruits that need to be stored in refrigerated containers, do you have the capacity to do it? So that you need a structured plan to develop your wharves to facilitate trade. You need a structured plan to ensure that all of your sectors that you intend to trade with are intact and obtaining the kind of assistance that they need because in the final analysis, foreign policy, foreign trade are only effective to the extent that you're producing it in the country. That's the first point I want to make. The second point I wanted to make is that when we were talking about integration, you seem worried that they're going after China. You seem worried that today it's CARICOM, tomorrow is UNICER. I think where the problem lies is at the level of policy formulation. We need to clearly formulate policies that the policies must put us in a position where we are clear as to what we're doing and where we're going. For instance, CARICOM is critical for these reasons, and we are going to pursue CARICOM matters in these areas. But then we need Brazil for some other reason, or UNICER. You must be clear in your mind. Then you will have the question of a currency within the Caribbean, a currency within the wider, which currency are you going to adopt, why? So that you are clear in your mind as to the purpose of each one of these integration movements and Guyana's interests in them. And once we clearly define the purpose of those movements, what are Guyana's interests in them, then we can be in as much integration movements as we want, but we are clear in our head. I believe if there is proper policy formulation and a clear understanding of why we are in what and for what purpose, then there is no problem. Take the Chinese. Clearly, Guyana needs to embrace the Chinese because the Chinese are moving in the world. But do we need to embrace them on the Chinese terms? That's another question. We need to embrace the Chinese. We need to embrace anybody on their terms. We need to embrace anybody that we embrace. We should be clear in our heads on what terms we are going to embrace them. Are they going to be allowed to come here and do as they like, or they are going to come and they're going to be mutual benefit and respect for us? I think once we can clearly define and understand those things, then we can progress. But the first point I made, I think it's critical. You have to deal with the problems in the society to make the society what it should be before that society could send out what it should send out and receive what it should receive.
I'd like to raise, if it's all right, I'd like to raise a question that's specific in relation to Guyana and the whole question of quote-unquote economic diplomacy. And it relates to the private sector. It's partly based upon my own experience. When I went to China, I'm not so sure that the Ghana private sector is as open and willing for joint ventures and for the involvement of external partners into their businesses as in some other CARICOM countries. The example I have is that in 1989, when we encouraged some Chinese companies that were interested in using Guyana's access to, I think it was then the CBI or CBI extended, I can't remember what it was, to get access to the United States market on clothing, for instance. That the local clothing manufacturers were not interested in having anybody join with them for whatever reason. I don't know. So what I'm saying that there may be constraints in terms of the way in which the private sector, some private sector businesses are structured that could inhibit the capacity for the involvement of joint venture partners.
Okay. But I think that must change in this new environment that is emerging.
You know, I'm just saying, I'm raising that issue.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know it's all changed, because if you follow the economic page in Stabrook News, I think it is, one of the trends you see is that a lot of these companies are not opening in the way they should open. They still continue to be like family businesses, etc. And therefore, I don't know that it has changed. There might have been some changes, but to say it has changed...
No, I say it must change.
Oh, okay.
I say it must change. No, I don't know if it has changed. I say it must change.
I'm just raising this.
No.
And there's an additional point. I think, too, not only in that area, I think the private sector has to recognize that in the early post-colonial period, those private sectors were state-dependent private sectors. Now they have to become independent private sector and develop the capacity to operate notwithstanding the state. And so I think it is in that direction that the private sector needs to go, because an independent private sector is a private sector that will be able to take initiatives and to carry their position to the government. And even if the government doesn't agree, whichever government it is, they will have the capacity to do what they want to do. To the extent that you're a dependent private sector, then I think you're inhibited. And that, I think, is something needs to be addressed.
I think as evolution continues, a lot of the large businesses are still family-owned or family-dominated. That natively means that if a family believes that the joint ventures or a direct investment in terms of shares or some kind of equity means a lessening of control, you're always going to have that kind of resistance and so on. I think as the economy opens, as it becomes more and more competitive, you're going to have to make these decisions to survive. You're not going to have the luxury to continue to say that you're not interested in joint ventures, you're not getting involved with those, you try to do it yourself, and so on and so forth. There's a finite amount of money you could get from local banking institutions. After a time, you got to find other forms of inflows, other forms of investment. So it's going to change from that perspective.
No, I don't just want to raise it in the private sector. I also want to raise it in the government agencies. That in government agencies, you have a tendency for protecting turf. And so the call that Aubrey made earlier about cooperation among ministry agencies is not easily attained, and it's something we have to address if the economic diplomacy is going to depend upon cooperation between the government agencies. So they have to recognize that the cooperation is to the benefit of the nation as a whole. For instance, the Ministry of Finance usually deals with the international financial institutions. But I don't think that they necessarily are trained in the methods of negotiation diplomacy. And I don't know that they bring to bear in all their activities all the benefits that can be derived from being properly versed in those skills. So that to the extent that there is resistance in cooperation, there is going to be a diminution in the capacity for the economic diplomacy to be successful.
But not only even the private sector, to me, needs training in negotiations, because if you're going to access market, make international agreements, you have got to develop the skills of negotiating, because you will need to understand all the factors surrounding negotiation, how to negotiate, when to make a decision, to see between the lines, to know when a particular formulation doesn't suit you or your country. So added to this whole list of things we're talking about is a need for a retraining of the private sector, civil society bodies, to ensure that they have the negotiating skills so that they could operate both in terms of domestic arrangement as well as international. You have situations where civil society groups dealing with AIDS have to deal with USAID. Do they have the required skills? So part of this process, I think one of the things globalization does is that it brings you into an international market with all its dimensions, and the small state has got to recognize that it has to do the training to ensure that the people they put out there can operate within the globalized world.
Well, the question also is, indeed, this institutional strengthening must be also part of the process. Institutions like university must partner with the private sector in this effort at retraining, at building new skill sets to face the challenges that, that you must expect in this environment. So that, Abi's correct, I think. It must be a multi-sectoral approach.
Yeah.
We have to engage all of the elements of the society. And I think the private sector, and once again, I speak with very limited knowledge of the private sector, but in Guyana, but I think that there's still, to my mind, a level of mistrust and suspicion that exists in the relationship between the state and the private sector. And I think they must be on the same page. Even though there are times in any arrangement where there be disagreements, I think that I've seen in the region a little bit of a disconnect sometimes between the state and the private, in the absence, I think, of structured policy arrangement that could guide both sides. So maybe I think that's what we need. One, the institutions of learning to be engaged with the private sector to ensure that there's this retraining, this re-engineering, new skill sets being available. But the private sector has a role to play in dealing with some of that. I don't think you leave for the state, for example, in a country like Ghana, only for the state to deal with UG. I think that the private sector must assist because they're beneficiaries. So engage university in a way that that could be mutually beneficial.
I think there are some partnerships which are not necessarily publicized in many instances, but that is really a faculty to business relationship, and it's not a proper arrangement with the University of Guyana as a whole to say that you do it. In fact, businesses might go to a particular department and say we'll do an internship and we'll help you with training and so on. But again, it's not a comprehensive process. But the question is, do we get it? I mean, these are discussions that we've had before. These are things that we know. We understand that if we don't get these things done, we are not going to be able to compete. Nobody is waiting for us. By the time we understand all the things that we have discussed, it might be too late in terms of being able to access the markets, no matter how we do it, whether it's niche market or mass market or whatever it is. I'm concerned a bit that across the board, it is either that we are accepting this slowly or not at all. And the question is, where do we go from here? If we're talking about economic diplomacy as we have described it and explained it, do the stakeholders get it in saying, well, you not only have the traditional businesses, you have new businesses, you have technology, you have innovation, you have all of these things, and all these things need to be represented at an international level and on all sides. whether it's the private sector, whether it's, whether it's the state in terms of a supporting environment and so on and so forth. Is it that this is a natural process, or shouldn't we be getting this faster? Should we be moving ahead a lot quicker, or is it just that it's the nature of things that because of whatever reasons we are not?
Well, I would venture a wide kind of answer. That is that we have to change our whole approach in this society from one of conflict to one of cooperation. I think the society operates at the moment, in my view, on the basis that conflict is the law of the day, not cooperation. I think we have to move from a dynamic of conflict, to a dynamic of cooperation. And this cuts across all aspects of our life, political, economic, social, everything. And until we can do that, we're just whistling in the wind.
Okay.
We are crafting solutions that we know cannot be implemented, will never be implemented, will not be implemented because of the existence of these prior conditions.
Okay.
And there are two other elements, I think. I agree with Mr. Jackson. But to me, to solve that, the society has to arrive at a point where all of these actors, their positions have got to be in public domain, so that when they renege or don't do what they're committed to, the world can know and it can be dealt with. In other words, there's need for a higher level of transparency.
Okay.
Then I think the other critical problem that affects Guyana all across, political, economic, social, is what I call the implementation deficit. We have been very good at analyzing the situation, coming up with proposals, but implementing, there's a great deficit. We need in the society, again, to do more training in the ability to implement and achieve objectives. In the village, there's an implementation deficit. In the state apparatus, an implementation deficit. In the political parties, an implementation deficit. And that comes because I think as a people, we have not mastered the art of one, planning, and then two, implementing, and then three, reviewing to see what mistakes we would have made and to improve, be critical of ourselves and move on. That implementation deficit. I add to that policy positions. We leave too many things to details. In a sense, we micromanage. We need to move to the level where there is clear policy formulation and people are guided by policy and people can know when a policy is violated and the action is taken, and then we implement based on an understanding of policy, etc.
Okay, fine now.
Well, I would say that economic diplomacy must be seen, I think, in the context of an extension of domestic policy. In other words, any foreign policy, I believe, reflects, in some ways, the domestic arrangements. So that in the absence of clear, organized, a kind of unified domestic space being developed, then there are limitations to economic diplomacy. So what in the case of Guyana, I would say, that is, indeed, there may be conflicts that are not easily solved. There are now new trends in the world. They talk about intractable conflicts will now become transformed, not resolved. But my view is that in countries like Ghana, you can transform some of those conflicts if there's will, and the will must come from all of the relevant stakeholders, to ensure that if we're really talking, if we're really serious about the implementation arrangement that Harvey speaks of, that it must come as a result of a kind of unified approach. We just can't leave it for chance and hope that some element in the private sector will do it. I think it has to be a structured arrangement, involving all the partners. If you say you leave, it's a policy of exclusion, that economic diplomacy we talk about would only be a pipe dream.
All right. Well, we only have an hour, regrettably, so we have come to the end of the program. I'm sorry, guys. I know we could probably spend a few more hours on this. Generally.
Not today.
But not today. A most enlightening discussion, and we really hope it will continue because this is critical to our national economic development. I'd like to thank our guest, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Norton, Dr. Curtin, for participating. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Republic Bank, Courts, and last but not least, let me thank our viewers for watching us as we bring these issues forward for discussion, analysis, comment. Until next time, good night.